As Sandra sifted through the damning evidence in the dimly lit office, her hands trembled, not from fear, but from anticipation. She was closer than ever to exposing LeBeau's darkest secrets, but the real danger was just beginning. You are welcome to our channel. We appreciate your continuous support and giving us the privilege to entertain and allow you unwind with these awesome stories. Don't miss out on any tales. Do well to subscribe to this channel. Before you commence this part 2, kindly watch the part 1 of this story to provide you with great insights and knowledge of Sandra's life events. So, Sandra looked up from the stack of papers she had been reviewing, her green eyes hard and unwavering. I have to, Chris. If I don't do this, they'll keep ruining more lives. I can't let that happen. Chris nodded slowly. All right. Then we need to plan this carefully. We only have one shot, and if we're not careful, they'll cover their tracks before the authorities can get involved. Sandra understood the gravity of what they were about to do. The hotel was like a fortress, and Amelia's father had powerful connections, but she wasn't scared. She had lived in fear for too long, and she refused to let it control her anymore. Together, they worked out the details. They would need to gather every piece of evidence they could and time the release perfectly. The night of Amelia's final wedding celebration was only a few days away, and it would be the perfect time to strike. The hotel would be full of guests, wealthy, influential people who would be caught in the crossfire when the truth came out. There would be no hiding from the scandal. Sandra's part in the plan was clear. She needed to gather enough physical evidence to link Amelia's father directly to the operation. Emails and documents were one thing, but solid proof, like the stash of drugs hidden within the hotel, would be the final nail in the coffin. If they could expose the drugs to the authorities, there would be no escaping justice. Chris would handle the logistics. As a former manager with access to the hotel's inner workings, he still had the keys to everything, literally and figuratively. He would ensure that the files were handed over to the authorities at exactly the right moment, giving them no time to destroy the evidence. But there was one final piece of the plan, one that made Sandra's stomach twist with anxiety. The drugs themselves. Chris had told her about the secret storeroom where the drugs were kept, hidden away in the basement of the hotel, beneath layers of security. It was a high-risk area, heavily guarded, but it was the key to exposing the operation. They would have to destroy it. Are you sure you're ready for this? Chris asked again, his voice quieter this time. It's going to be dangerous. If anything goes wrong. Sandra cut him off with a determined shake of her head. I'm ready, she said firmly. I have to do this. And so, the plan was set. The night of Amelia's wedding celebration would be the moment everything came crashing down. Sandra would slip away from the party, make her way to the basement, and set fire to the drugs. Chris would be waiting for her in the control room, ready to alert the authorities. Once the fire started, the hotel's guests would panic, the authorities would arrive, and the truth would finally be exposed. As the days passed, Sandra prepared herself mentally and physically for what lay ahead. She was filled with a mixture of fear and anticipation, her emotions running high as the day of the wedding approached. But through it all, her resolve never wavered. This was her chance to take back control, to end the cycle of exploitation and pain. On the day of the wedding, the hotel was alive with activity. Guests arrived in waves, dressed in the finest gowns and tuxedos, their laughter and excitement filling the air. LeBeau was once again the center of attention, its beauty and grandeur masking the dark secrets that hid within its walls. Sandra moved through the crowd like a shadow, her mind focused on the task at hand. She had dressed carefully, wearing a simple yet elegant gown that allowed her to blend in, unnoticed among the wealthy guests. But beneath her calm exterior, her heart raced with adrenaline. Chris had done his part, ensuring that the security guards stationed near the storeroom were distracted for just long enough to allow Sandra to slip inside. The plan was in motion, and there was no turning back. As the night grew darker, Sandra knew it was time. She slipped away from the ballroom, her heart pounding as she made her way through the maze of hallways that led to the basement. The sounds of the party faded behind her, replaced by the eerie silence of the hotel's lower levels. When she reached the door to the storeroom, her hands trembled as she entered the code Chris had given her. The door clicked open, revealing shelves stacked with packages of drugs, proof of everything that had been hidden for so long. Sandra's breath caught in her throat as she looked around the room. This was it. This was the moment everything would change. She reached into her bag and pulled out the lighter. With one last steadying breath, she flicked it open and touched the flame to the nearest pile of packages. The fire caught quickly, spreading through the storeroom like a wave of destruction. The heat intensified as the flames consumed the drugs, sending black smoke curling up toward the ceiling. Sandra stepped back, her heart pounding in her chest as she watched the fire grow. It was done. Now, all she had to do was get out. But as she turned to leave, she heard footsteps. Heavy, fast, heading straight toward her. Her stomach dropped. Something had gone wrong. The door flew open, and there stood Amelia's father, his face twisted with rage. "You really think you could destroy everything I've built?" he growled, stepping toward her. His once polished appearance was now overshadowed by the fury etched across his face. Sandra's mind raced. She hadn't expected this, hadn't anticipated him finding her here. Chris had assured her the guards would be distracted, but something had gone wrong. There was no turning back now. The fire was already spreading, thick smoke filling the room, curling toward the ceiling. Sandra's breath caught in her throat as she stared at him, her body tensing as if bracing for a physical blow. She had prepared for this moment, but the reality of standing face to face with the man who had caused her so much pain made her feel small, vulnerable. Yet, something inside her had changed. She wasn't the scared, helpless girl from 5 years ago. She wasn't going to run anymore. With trembling hands, she took a step back, her eyes locking with his. "It's over," she said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her. "I've seen everything. I know everything. And soon, so will the world." Amelia's father sneered, his lips curling into a cruel smile. "You think anyone will believe you?" he asked, taking another step closer. "You're just a dancer. No one cares what you have to say." The words stung, but Sandra stood her ground. "I have the evidence," she replied, her voice gaining strength. "All of it, and when the authorities arrive, they'll find more than just a fire. They'll find the truth." His eyes darkened at her words, and for the first time, Sandra saw something flicker across his face. Doubt. He hadn't expected her to be this prepared, to have a plan beyond destruction. But he wasn't done yet. He stepped forward, close enough now that Sandra could feel the heat of his anger, the intensity of his presence. "You're not walking out of here," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You think you can burn down my operation and just leave. You've made a terrible mistake." Sandra's pulse quickened, but she forced herself to stay calm. Her mind worked quickly, scanning the room for an escape. The flames were growing larger, the smoke thicker, and the heat more intense. She needed to get out, and fast. But Amelia's father was blocking her way, his frame towering over her. "I won't let you hurt anyone else," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "This ends now." A twisted grin spread across his face. "No," he said coldly. "It doesn't end. Not for you." Suddenly, he lunged at her, grabbing her arm with a grip so tight it made her wince in pain. Sandra struggled against him, her body jerking as she tried to free herself. Panic surged through her, but she refused to give in. She had come too far, had fought too hard, to be stopped now. In the chaos of the moment, Sandra kicked at him, catching him off guard as her heel connected with his shin. He grunted in pain, loosening his grip just enough for her to break free. Without wasting a second, she darted toward the door, her heart pounding in her chest as the flames licked at her back. But Amelia's father wasn't giving up. He moved quickly, recovering from the blow, and lunged for her again. This time, he grabbed her by the wrist, yanking her backward with enough force to send her stumbling to the ground. Sandra's body hit the floor hard, pain shooting through her as she struggled to regain her footing. The fire was spreading rapidly now, the smoke thickening by the second. The heat was becoming unbearable, the room filling with the crackling sounds of destruction as the flames devoured everything in their path. Sandra's mind raced. She had to get out. If she didn't, everything she had worked for, everything she had uncovered, would go up in flames with the hotel. But Amelia's father loomed over her, his eyes wild with fury. He was too close, and she was out of options. Just as he reached for her again, a loud crash echoed through the room. The door burst open, and Chris appeared, his face pale and eyes wide, as he took in the scene before him. "Sandra!" he shouted, rushing forward. Without hesitation, Chris charged toward Amelia's father, tackling him to the ground with a force that knocked the wind out of both men. Sandra scrambled to her feet, her body shaking as she backed away from the struggle. Amelia's father fought back, throwing punches as he tried to break free from Chris's grip, but Chris was determined. He had hesitated too many times in the past, and now he knew there was no more room for hesitation. He had to stop this man once and for all. "Go!" Chris yelled at Sandra, his voice strained as he fought to keep Amelia's father pinned. "Get out of here. Now." Sandra hesitated for only a second. The flames were too close, the smoke choking her lungs. She couldn't stay any longer. She turned and ran, her heart pounding as she raced through the hallway, away from the fire, away from the danger. The heat from the fire trailed after her, the smoke swirling around her as she ran, her heels clacking against the marble floor. Her lungs burned from the smoke, but she pushed herself harder, faster, determined to reach safety. She burst through the doors of the basement and into the cool night air, gasping as the fresh air filled her lungs. The ballroom was still alive with the sounds of music and laughter, completely unaware of the chaos that was unfolding below. Sandra's hands trembled as she looked around. She knew the authorities would be arriving soon. Chris had made sure to tip them off before the plan had gone into motion. She glanced back at the basement door, her heart heavy with uncertainty. She didn't know what had happened to Chris after she ran. Had he gotten out, or had Amelia's father overpowered him? But there was no time to dwell on it now. Sandra spotted a group of security guards rushing toward the basement, followed by a growing crowd of concerned guests. The fire alarms were starting to go off, and panic was beginning to spread through the ballroom. It was time for the truth to come out. Sandra stepped away from the chaos and pulled out the phone she had hidden in her bag. On it was every piece of evidence she and Chris had gathered over the past week. The documents, the emails, the records that would expose the drug operation and everyone involved. With trembling hands, she dialed the number for the authorities. "It's over," she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible over the rising panic around her. "They're going to pay for everything." And as she pressed send, the sirens of the approaching police cars filled the night air, signaling the beginning of the end for Le Beau Hotel's reign of darkness. The sound of sirens pierced the night air as police cars screeched to a halt outside Le Beau Hotel, their flashing lights casting eerie shadows across the manicured gardens. Sandra stood off to the side, her breath coming in shaky gasps as the chaos unfolded around her. She could see the guests spilling out of the ballroom, their elegant gowns and tailored suits a stark contrast to the rising panic in their faces. The once perfect evening had turned into a nightmare, and for the first time, Le Beau's dark secrets were about to be exposed. Sandra clutched her phone tightly, her heart still racing from the events in the basement. The evidence she and Chris had gathered, proof of the drug operation, the corruption, and the lives destroyed, was ready to be handed over. The authorities had been tipped off, and now it was only a matter of time before the truth was revealed. But even as the police arrived, Sandra couldn't shake the fear that gnawed at her. She had escaped the fire, but Chris was still down there, facing off against Amelia's father. She didn't know if he had made it out alive. Tears stung her eyes as she thought about Chris, the man who had once been her enemy but had ultimately become her ally. He had made mistakes, terrible mistakes, but in the end, he had tried to make things right. Sandra had never fully trusted him, not after everything he had been a part of, but now, standing alone in the chaos, she realized how much he had risked to help her. He had put his life on the line to stop Amelia's father and to help bring justice to those who had suffered. The fire alarms continued to blare, the sound ringing in her ears as firefighters rushed into the hotel to battle the growing flames. Smoke billowed from the basement, dark and heavy, and Sandra's heart clenched with worry. She wanted to run back in, to see if Chris was okay, but she knew that wasn't an option. She had to trust that he had found a way out, just as she had. Suddenly, the sound of heavy footsteps approaching made Sandra turn. A group of police officers was making their way toward her, their expressions serious. One of them, a tall man with a stern face, stepped forward. "Are you Sandra?" he asked, his voice calm but authoritative. Sandra nodded, her voice caught in her throat. She quickly pulled her phone from her bag and handed it to the officer. "I have the evidence," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Everything you need to bring them down. It's all on there." The officer took the phone, his eyes flicking over the screen as he scrolled through the files. His expression didn't change, but Sandra could see the tension in his jaw as he realized the magnitude of what he was holding. This was more than just a case of drugs. It was an entire criminal operation hidden beneath one of the city's most prestigious hotels. And now, thanks to Sandra, they had the proof they needed to tear it all apart. "We'll take it from here," the officer said, motioning for his colleagues to move in. "You've done the right thing." Sandra nodded, relief washing over her, but it was quickly overshadowed by the overwhelming exhaustion that weighed on her shoulders. She had done what she came to do, but the fight wasn't over yet. There were still so many questions, so many loose ends. What would happen to Amelia's father? Would justice truly be served? And what about Chris? Had he survived the fire? As if in answer to her thoughts, Sandra's attention was drawn to a commotion near the entrance of the hotel. Two paramedics were rushing out of the building, guiding a stretcher between them. Sandra's breath hitched as she strained to see who was on it. Her heart pounded in her chest as the stretcher emerged into the light. It was Chris. He was conscious, but barely. His face was pale, his clothes covered in soot and ash. His breathing was labored, and his body was limp on the stretcher. But he was alive. Sandra let out a shaky breath, a flood of emotions crashing over her. Relief, guilt, gratitude, all of it hit her at once as she watched the paramedics load Chris into the ambulance. She wanted to run over to him, to tell him everything was going to be okay. But her legs felt like they were made of lead. All she could do was watch as the ambulance doors closed, and the sirens blared once again, whisking him away to the hospital. She hoped he would be okay. He had saved her life after all. As the hours dragged on, the full scope of the situation became clear. The police combed through the hotel, finding more evidence of the drug operation, including hidden stashes of drugs and financial records implicating some of the most powerful men in the city. Amelia's father had flowed in the chaos of the fire, but Sandra knew it was only a matter of time before they caught him. The authorities had everything they needed to bring him down, and there was no escaping the truth now. Amelia, on the other hand, wasn't as lucky. Sandra watched from a distance as the police questioned her, her once perfect smile now replaced with a look of shock and fear. She had been caught in her own web of lies, and there was no running from it. She had turned a blind eye to the suffering of so many, and now she would have to face the consequences. But for Sandra, there was a bittersweet sense of closure. She had done what she set out to do. She had exposed the truth, destroyed the operation, and helped bring justice to those who had been wronged. But it had come at a cost. The weight of everything she had endured, everything she had fought for, still hung heavily over her. The scars would remain. As the sun began to rise over the city, casting a soft golden light across the now silent hotel, Sandra found herself standing alone by the gates of Le Beau. The chaos had quieted, and the guests had all gone home, their evening of luxury shattered by the revelations of the night. It was over now. The nightmare had ended. Sandra didn't know. For so long, her life had been defined by the darkness of Le Beau, by the pain and fear that had held her captive. Now, for the first time in years, she was free. Free to rebuild her life, free to find out who she was beyond the trauma, beyond the scars. And for Sandra, it was the start of something new. A future where she was no longer a victim. A future where she was in control. A future filled with hope. Do you think Sandra did the right thing by setting the drugstore ablaze? Is Sandra truly free? Do you think Chris should die or deserve a second chance? What of Amelia and her father? Is a longer jail term deserving? Interested in watching the third part? Hit the subscribe button. Relax as it continues soonest. But what would come next? Thanks for watching and see you in the next video. Bye for now.